Just again, a little more context. So anything you want to talk about, false confessions, wrongful convictions, I'm happy to answer what's going on in the United States specifically. I'll have Linda describe a little bit more kind of about your work. I know some of these are your responsibility that's in this room here, so you probably know a little bit about her, but maybe a little more background about kind of you and what you focus on.
What I think is very important, like this movie is the perfect example that behind all the numbers that researchers and me including, that we investigate that there are real people. And this is just one story, and there are stories all around the world. This is not just an American thing. And that's what I hear so often when I talk about wrongful convictions. Everyone says, but that's in the United States. We don't have that here. So what we did 2 years ago now is that we started a European Registry of Exonerations, and we haven't even investigated every single country. And we're already at 144 people in Europe, including the Netherlands, Germany, 20 different European countries where people are wrongfully convicted and then exonerated for crimes that they didn't do. And in the film, we heard that on average, it was 14 years in the US that people spend in prison. In the Netherlands or in Europe, it's still 7 years. So it's 7 times that someone didn't sit at the Christmas table, or 7 years that were lost. So I think it's very important to also see, there's also in Asia, in South America, in South Africa. So this happens everywhere, but also in Europe. That was one thing that I wanted to mention for today.
I'm going to have Jia just describe a little bit about kind of how you got into this case specifically. One thing I think is fascinating to me working with law enforcement is I feel like Jia probably did more investigation into this case than it seems like the original detectives may have done. But all the work that you saw was you, pretty much. I know you had a couple of hands carrying cameras, but this was pretty much your show. That's a lot of work to put a film together. So what got you focused on Jeff's case?
I started advocating for a different man who was in prison for a murder that he didn't commit. He was also a high school student when he got involved in his situation. And as I was doing a fundraiser for his legal defense fund and working with his family, a friend of mine who was helping me organize a fundraiser in New York said, I know a guy, do you want to meet him? And he has a very, very similar story. He was also a high school student when this happened to him. And of course I said yes, and she introduced me to Jeff. She had met Jeff at a bar and learned of his story, and she introduced me to him, and he agreed to be the keynote speaker at my fundraiser for this other person. And as a result, Jeff and I, Jeff was the only person that I knew back then who'd been wrongfully convicted, like personally that I knew. And so when I was advocating for these other people, I decided after watching Making a Murderer, which some of you might be too young to remember, but I saw Making a Murderer on TV and I thought it got so many eyeballs and it got so many people to care about that case that films were maybe a better way to do advocacy work. And so I went to film school. When I went to film school, Jeff was the only person I knew personally that had been through this experience and had this lived experience. So I approached him and said, would you let me film you? And he said yes. And so it's been 7 years that I've been following him around and filming him, and that's how this film came to be.
I've got plenty of questions to ask them, but what questions do you all have? Anything that was going through your mind when you were watching the film?
Our lessons learned, are there any changes or protecting juveniles in situations? Did the police get other training, instructions, all these kind of things which appear in all the process?
Sure. I can only speak on the U.S. and then you can.
Yeah.
So lessons learned, specifically with juveniles. What's kind of crazy in the United States, law enforcement is legally allowed to lie about evidence during an interrogation. So a detective it's a Supreme Court ruling from 1969, that an investigator could say, we have your fingerprints, or we have your DNA, or we have witnesses, even if that doesn't exist, which is pretty crazy. Since then, since 2021, we now have 11 states that have passed legislation that if detectives lie about evidence, any confession is inadmissible in court, and there's different kind of degrees of that. So that's a huge shift, which is great. The type of interviews that are being conducted has been really a global change, but in the last probably decade, I would say, there's a huge movement towards evidence-based, science-based interviewing. So investigators are getting more informed on not just how to interview juveniles or youthful people differently, but how to interview everybody differently. More trauma-informed approach, more evidence-based approach, how memory works. You can see with Jeff, he's really trying to help the police. There's Jeff right there. With Jeff, and he'll talk about this, but his mentality is he was really trying to help the investigators, was his mindset as he's going through the conversation. And so making sure investigators are trained is what is that person experiencing, especially depending on what kind of risk factors they might have, including being youthful person.
I think in Europe it's similar. So there have been some advances in the way that we talk to people in the interrogation room. And where I think that we should still improve is with life after exoneration. So now we're trying to make sure that this doesn't happen, but what if it already happened? What do you do? So recognizing that you made a mistake and being strong enough to step up and make good, if you can. I think that that's still lacking. And the research on life after exoneration is all quite new. So that's something that we've been looking into now, but that's, a way to go, I think, because it doesn't end when you are sent out from prison, or if in court they finally say that you're innocent, or maybe they'll just say that you cannot be considered guilty, which can be problematic for many of these people. So what we've also heard is that they really love these type of registries. The same that Jeff said that he had this book with him to show that he was actually innocent. Like, people have also reached out to us at the European registry saying, like, I love being on your page because that validates that I was innocent. And I think that that's where we can still improve a lot, also in science.
And then I'll let Jia speak to this. The other shift, thanks to films like this, is more people are learning about these cases, right? Like, so for me, when we're training law enforcement, I can just go in a class and I can say, do this differently. But when they can hear from Jeff and they can hear Jia help amplify those voices, there's a story, there's a person behind it. And we're seeing that jurors, people that serve on a jury, are now watching films and are more educated when they are going to evaluate a decision. So I don't know how many screenings you've seen, you've done of this, but how big this has become from the media's perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I hear it all the time. I even heard from actually David Rothenberg from the Fortune Society, who, he's in the States. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but he said you don't know how many policy conversations that your film has been mentioned in, which is like great to hear, And then Jeff himself had made an impact on a lot of legislative work, which is fantastic. The flip side of that I found fascinating in the process of making this film, which I learned so much about everything to do with wrongful convictions in the filmmaking process. But the people who are innocent are the most susceptible to speaking to police without waiving their Miranda rights, or even they think they're helping because they think they have nothing to hide, and in turn they end up in situations like Jeff was, where all their words are being twisted and are being used against them. And honestly, before making the film, I thought if police asked me for help in some case, I would say, sure, why not? Because I want to be helpful and I'm a helpful person and I have nothing to hide, and why wouldn't I help in this case? But really, you have to say nothing and you have to ask for a lawyer, which is, a lot of young people don't know that. So it's great if they learn that from films like this. It can make a world of difference.
What other questions? Anything else you felt?
There are about 100 questions, but I would love to.
Sure. Yeah.
But at this point, I would really like to limit myself to expressing very, very profound thanks to you for having made this documentary. I have some personal reasons to be strongly impacted by it, because I have myself contact with several wrongly convicted persons, and I think it was very, very well made. To me, as someone from the public, it was a very clear story. It was very strong in its messaging. I think it's terribly important to make this kind of movies. I think that its impact is maybe stronger than you yourself So many thanks for pushing on
Thank
about
you. That's so
better
kind. I appreciate that. But if you have 100 questions, feel free to ask one or
Yeah,
two.
go for it.
Shall we move to Jeff?
If you like, yeah, that's ready for us.
Or do you have any specific questions just for us?
Yeah.
I just was wondering, is there any youth detention facilities in America, or is everyone just put into general?
There are youth detention facilities, but the unfortunate thing is very, very often in multiple cases that other films I'm working on, they're 16, 17-year-olds and, even 20-year-olds, they get put into adult prisons when they should be tried as children and not as adults, and it happens so frequently, and you guys can speak to it.
Yeah, I know there's a lot we could talk about with that, but to keep it simple, even the legislation that's changing, that's trying to protect juveniles, we use that term, but the research shows you don't just turn 18 and all of a sudden everything you do is right and intelligent, because I'm sure we can all relate to that. And so it's really around 25-ish is when people start to become more cognitively developed and more mature. And so even legislatively, it's kind of hard to figure out when does somebody go from a minor to an adult. And unfortunately, what we hear a lot of is even if there's somebody 16, you'll hear people on the opposing side of these arguments say, well, yes, they're 16 by age, but they've got criminal history or they're more street smart, so we should treat them like an adult. And not realizing that if you're 16, you're 16, right? And your immediate gratification, you're not thinking as maybe thoroughly as you might when you're 35 or 40. And so a lot can be done still. And in the States, they're doing a lot of work where juveniles have been sentenced to life without parole, and they're revisiting those cases now, realizing that maybe that was an unfair decision at the time. So there's a lot of reform in that area specifically.
I mean, do you want to speak? You probably know this better than I do, but specifically about the prefrontal cortex of your brain develops differently for men and women, and I think for men it doesn't develop till something like, is it
There was
23
no
years
need to
old?
Do
trash
they
on
ever
men.
develop
There's
fully?
I knew that was coming. There was a way. But right, I mean, there's so much. One of the simplest things, there's not a lot of education right now for investigators on how to handle youthful people differently or any vulnerable population differently. And so there's a lot of research coming out with that. But something really simple, like when you're of a younger age, I mean, you're thinking more about immediate gratification. Like, what does this do for me right now? And you've all probably heard or experienced, like, posting something on social media might feel good in the moment, but 10 years from now, that might haunt you when you're trying to get a job or do something else. But you're not thinking that way. The same thing happens in the interrogation room. Is a 16 or 17-year-old person might think, like, how do I just get out of this room and get back to safety? How do I let the parents figure it out? How do I let the attorneys figure it out? And not realize by just cooperating in that moment, it might be a lifelong decision. And so there's things like that as youthful people are not fully comprehending at the time.
And I've heard time and time again, people who have falsely confessed. I'm working on a different case right now with false confession where they said that, all the DNA and scientific evidence would prove my innocence, and I knew that because I didn't do it. So I thought if I can just get out of this room for now, and they're telling me if I just say this, I can go home to my parents or whatever, everything will work itself out. And that's what they think. And then it doesn't at all because they use it against them, till the end. And that speaks to the same phenomenon.
We look like Jeff's back on timeout for a second, so we can.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Something that also was said in the film, that some people, for example, are imprisoned in Sing Sing, which is an executed prison, I assume.
It is.
For example, blood possession for longer than someone who might have committed a murder. Do you guys also work with people who have committed a crime that's no longer a crime, like drug possession, for example? In a lot of states that's legal now, but there's still people in prison who are there on drug possession charge. Is that something you guys also are involved in, or?
I've thought a lot about this,
Yeah.
exactly this, especially with marijuana becoming legal, and then there's all these people with really harsh sentences. And I have never worked on a case like that, but I'm very interested in doing so because it's bizarre that wouldn't go backwards and kind of clear these. But I don't know if you guys have experience in this.
No, not really, but I know that stigma on people being in prison, being rightfully in prison, being wrongfully in prison is almost the same in the public's opinion. So it doesn't really matter just having been in prison, if it's just for a day, if it's for 20 years, or just being accused of something, and in the end there was no trial at all because it wasn't true, leaves a stigma, and a society will think that you are guilty. So I think, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about the film and Jeff's story, obviously what he's doing now is incredible work, and I'm sure he'll share some of that. But a lot of times you hear these stories and it ends with, okay, the person was exonerated, we're done. And not realizing there's a huge gap there, like you said, of even though you get exonerated, you still have maybe 16 years, maybe we've met people 40 years that they were incarcerated. They have no credit history or job history, no email address, no social media presence. And now you try to go get a job, or you try to meet somebody in a relationship and explain where you've been for the last 3 decades and say, I've been in prison, but I swear I was innocent. I mean, the stigma is really hard to get past. And we have people who've been convicted of sex offenses. So even in the process, somebody had to be on a sex offender registry, and their name is, and they've been innocent. But all the process takes a lot of time, and so that stigma is difficult. One thing, and Gia's worked with a lot of people similar to Jeff's experience. We've talked about this. I rarely have I met somebody who's angry, and I mean, I would be
Yeah, me too.
mad. And most people, if not everyone that we've talked to in this experience, comes out grateful for life, probably more than we all are. And I don't know if you got anything more to say about that, but amazes me is the spirit of people afterwards.
I always think that that's something that needs a psychological study done around it, because it is fascinating how many of us who've never had this experience, all of us say, I would be angry. I would be angry at everybody. Like, I feel like my life was ruined and stolen, but 100% of the people, like Dave said, that I know, and I probably know about 40 people who were wrongfully convicted today in my personal life through this work, and 100% of them are not angry. They're just so thankful and so grateful for every day, and it makes sense because they were at their lowest low. They had everything taken from them, even family members believing. Like, I interviewed some of the guys from the Central Park 5, and they said even my family members, some of my uncles and stuff, thought that I did it. So I can see how you come out the other end and you're just grateful for all the positivity in your life and your freedom. But I just don't think that would be me. But clearly there's something happening psychologically where I'm wrong. And that would be what would probably happen. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and what we also found is that it's very important, like, having someone believing in you. It doesn't have to be everyone, but just one person. And for the Dutch people here, I would recommend reading the book 400 brieven van mijn moeder van Jozef Oebelkas. And that's also, like, you're going to cry. But it's the most wonderful relation that he has with his mom while he's in prison in Morocco. And she writes him like, oh, I can't say the phrase, but it's so beautiful. And she's like, you have like secret wings and you'll be able to fly one day. And it's so beautiful. And he is so resilient, and he's actually the funniest, happiest, most wonderful person that I know. So there is something about wrongfully convicted people being so resilient, and it's like I would be crying in a corner, probably.
Yeah. I think the last thing with that, people want to be believed, they just want to be heard. And really what we've kind of left our law enforcement message with is just to be curious. Like, an investigator should just be curious. A lot of times there's assumptions made. And everybody, similar to Jeff that we've talked to, they just want somebody to at least hear their story, because a lot of times they haven't been heard. They haven't been heard by the detectives. They haven't been heard in court. You heard Jeff, and he'll talk about this. Didn't get to testify about what his version of his narrative, right? He didn't get to be heard. So that's just a really important piece, I think.